almost single-handedly responsible for thrusting this into the light, this terrible subject. What does it feel like to see this gigantic onslaught of files after all this time?
Well, I wish I could say it was somewhat satisfying to finally see some truth in this, but the way that this is being handled right now by the administration is very chaotic and, it's very messy, and it's very hard to figure out what's what when half a document is redacted, when the recipients and the person that sent the document is redacted. So I think in some ways this raises more questions and makes the public more distrustful because they weren't supposed to do this. This wasn't, it was supposed to be an act of transparency. And I don't see it as that, quite frankly.
Would you say that the release of these documents is purposeful or chaotic on purpose or chaotic because of a chaotic administration?
I think it's both. I actually think part of it was done on purpose, because, it's sort of like what this administration does, distract, try to take people's minds off of things, to confuse. So I think part of it is purpose. But I also think from reading what I've read so far that it also has to be a reflection on the fact that the Justice Department has never really organized themselves well enough to figure out how to go about this investigation. It is so massive. And I think that it was just something that they just never got a handle on to begin with.
How many documents are there?
They're saying 6 million because they released 3 million, and they say that there's 2 to 3 million documents left. Now, remember, though, part of this is a lot of repetition. Some of these documents you see multiple times. But, the other interesting thing is we haven't seen any of Epstein's emails from around the time that he was buddies with Trump. So we can't get a handle. Not that Trump used emails, but that was when Trump was in his orbit, so to speak. So we're not getting any view of what was going on during that time period, which would have been like the early 2000s.
What specifically have you been able to look at that surprises you in all the documents that have come your way? What have you found out?
That this is a lot bigger, and it spans the globe more so than I ever thought before. And I say this because, from my early reporting, I had spoken to investigators who looked into Epstein, who said that he had recruiters, for example, and scouts in other countries to get Epstein women. We are now seeing from some of these emails that he had them, not just a couple scouts. I mean, he had scouts almost, it seems like, in almost every country.
What does that mean? He had people looking out for teenage girls to bring to the United States?
Yes. And he had lawyers, by the way, he hired lawyers that did their visas to get them over here on work permits. I mean, he used his modeling agency as a way to get them over here. But it was clear they definitely were not just here to do modeling. In my original reporting, I reported that there was a bookkeeper for that modeling agency who did a deposition, and she said that was not what this was about, that there were these so-called parties and events that were held that they would send models to, but it was essentially to have sex. It was sending them there to have sex.
You're publishing a story that has implications for the President of the United States where the Epstein case is concerned. What does it say?
We have found a document in these files that is an interview that the police chief of Palm Beach gave to the FBI. And in that interview, the police chief, Michael Ryder, told the FBI that back when Epstein's case first came to the attention of the police and Epstein was first reported as a suspect in doing this, around 2006, around that time period, Trump called the police chief, and he said to the police chief thank God you're doing something about him because, and I'm just quoting off the top of my head, I don't have the document in front of me, but he said, thank God everybody knew. He also, by the way, told the chief that Maxwell was involved and that she was quote unquote evil. So he also knew about Maxwell's role. You know, we have this FBI report of this interview that the chief gave to the FBI where he is recalling this conversation that he had with Trump many, many years ago about Epstein. So it does raise some questions about, you know, how much Trump knew, you know, whether he knew the extent of Epstein's crimes.
Just hang on for a second. So in 2006, Donald Trump has what kind of communication with the police chief?
He called the police chief on the phone.
And there's paper on that.
There's a report. There's an FBI report. It's an interview that the police chief gave to the FBI in
So what does that
2020.
suggest to you about Trump? That he was doing the right thing or that he was complicit in some way?
You know, I think people are going to look at it one of two ways. A, that he, you know, was somewhat of an informant for the police in that he called them after this case, you know, became active and he became aware of it. And, you know, admitted, wait a minute, you know, I know he was doing this. Or you could look at it another way in that he was also one of those people that knew and really didn't go to the police before then to tell them what he was doing, because the police were sort of hearing that there were things happening at Epstein's mansion well before this. But every time they went to investigate, all the women that were coming and going that they saw on the street and stopped were of age. So they couldn't find any evidence that a real crime was being committed. But if in fact Trump knew that there was some crimes being committed against underage girls, and he knew about it and didn't tell them ahead of time, I guess people will look at that from a different vantage point in that he should have told the police sooner.
So this is after he was arrested?
That's right. That's right.
Your sources are not just law enforcement. You've talked to a lot of survivors. How are they reacting to these documents?
Well, they're disturbed and very upset because their names are still in there. I mean, the FBI only had one job here, and that was to take out the victims' names. And their names are sprinkled throughout these documents. So they're quite irate about the fact that, you know, they have so many redactions of people, other people, but yet many of the victims' names are still in these public documents.
What are the stakes for Donald Trump? Trump says he wants the country to move on from this story. But as you report, Trump is on an FBI list of people suspected of possible wrongdoing in connection with Epstein. The DOJ says that there is no credible evidence to pursue. So where are we?
Well, I think that they should pursue everybody. And I think the victims, that's all the victims want. They want they want a credible investigation. Talk about credible tips or credible allegations. They want a credible investigation. And they're not seeing it. And quite frankly, thus far, I haven't seen it, because you can say that someone's not credible, but there has to be some kind of notes. There has to be a report. There has to be some evidence that they went and talked to these people. Or if they couldn't talk to them, why? And we're not seeing that. And I think that's part of the problem here. The government can say all they want. There's no credible evidence, nothing to see here, nothing more to investigate. But this case from the beginning has been, a thorn in the Justice Department's side, because the public doesn't trust that they did what they were supposed to do, that the government, that the investigators were thorough.
One of the people in Donald Trump's orbit, in his cabinet, that comes up a lot in the new documents is the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick. Tell me about that.
He was a next-door neighbor to, as I understand it, to Epstein in New York. And it sounds like he had been invited with his wife to Epstein's mansion. He mentioned in an interview that he felt creepy when he got into the mansion. I don't know if you've seen photographs of his mansion, but there are some creepy aspects to it. Photographs on the wall, paintings, eyeballs, just very weird things in his house. So he said, after he had that brief tour, he felt, like, this is horrible. I never want to, do anything again. I'm not ever going, I don't want anything to do with this man again. And he said this publicly, and then we found documents in these files that showed that not only did he continue to communicate with him after this allegedly happened, but he even, got an invite to the island and took his family to Epstein's island. So, you have to wonder, why he would.
This is where I have to stop you.
Crazy.
You have no reason of knowing the answer, but I have to bring it up. Why would you bring your family to Epstein's Island? There are a lot of islands in the Caribbean and elsewhere. You can take your family anywhere on vacation when you have the money that Howard Lutnick has.
Yeah.
Why would you bring your children there?
I can't answer it. There were plenty of other people in that category, too, that brought their families there. So, yeah.
Not exactly
I can't
Disneyland.
No, I can't really answer that question.
Julie, I want to play you a clip of Congressman Ted Lieu, who comes from Southern California, speaking on February 3rd.
Why are Republicans so interested in Bill and Hillary Clinton? It's because they're trying to distract from the fact that Donald Trump is in the Epstein files thousands and thousands of times. In those files, there's highly disturbing allegations of Donald Trump raping children, of Donald Trump threatening to kill children. So I encourage your press to go look at these allegations.
Wait, now there's a lot to unpack here. Let's start with Congressman Lieu mentioning allegations of Donald Trump raping and threatening to kill children. What is he talking about?
Well, there's, when they arrested Epstein in 2019, they put out on sort of a big call that the prosecutor did, and they wanted more victims to come forward, so they put out this 800 number tip line that you can call from the FBI. So the FBI got, I want to say, hundreds of tips. And there were a couple that mentioned Trump. Now, some of them were a little bizarre that you would sort of think, no way, eating, I don't know, babies, or there's some strange ones in there that you could see were just
Who's saying
crazy.
these things? Who's making these accusations?
Well, these are people that call the tip line. I have a tip on Jeffrey Epstein
So it could
and
be
Donald Trump.
It could be
Could be
any
anybody.
malicious lunatic out there. Let's be very clear.
It could be. But, my point in this is, there was one I know that involved a 13-year-old girl where they said that she was giving Trump oral sex and she bit him and he slapped her. This is one of the tips that came in. And what the FBI and the Justice Department is saying, this tip list, by the way, we think that they didn't mean for it to be put out there in this tranche of documents. My point isn't whether it should have been made public or not. My point is that we can't see whether they followed up on all these tips, and certainly they should have followed up on the ones, that had names attached to them.
One of the most shocking revelations in this document dump was how many prominent people continued to engage with Epstein after he was registered as a sex offender. I'm not asking you as a psychologist or a sociologist. How do you explain that? And what was known to the general public about his crimes at the time?
Well, that's really a good question because you have to sort of break it down. You have to remember that when he was in Florida and he served that year, 13 months in jail, he had pled guilty to essentially what was a prostitution with a minor charge, okay? And when he came out of jail, he really mounted a PR campaign, hired a lot of people that can help him with his image, to point out
Like
that this
Peggy
was
Siegel, the PR person.
yeah, to point out, and he did press release. We could see it in the history that he was doing all these donating tons of money to all these causes and trying to just improve his image. And when you think about it, if all you knew at the time, oh, well, this is the charge on paper, was that he solicited a minor for prostitution. That's what the charge was. But as the years wore on, by like 2010, 2011, there were underage girls who filed civil lawsuits against him. And there was a huge lawsuit that was filed against the United States government for giving him this plea deal, which, by the way, they kept secret for a whole year until he got out of jail. And that was by design, because they did not want the victims to know that they did this deal, because they knew the victims would protest. And then the judge would say, well, wait a minute, I've got 25 victims in court here that are protesting this. I'm not going to approve this plea deal. So it was done the way it was. His lawyers were pretty brilliant and figured out a way to make it look like he hadn't really committed a serious of crime. They limited the scope of his crimes.
Julie, when you inevitably punched your own name into the search engine of these files, what did you discover?
Well, just like everything Epstein, in Epstein's, in his mind, he wants to control the narrative. And he wanted to meet with me after my series ran.
Did he reach out to you personally?
No.
So he never did try to meet with you?
He was advised that it probably wasn't a good idea, his idea of doing that. And followed it.
Yeah.
I guess.
I have to confess, of course, I punched my name in there and thinking it would come up 0. And there it was multiple times. It was just articles that people had sent him writing about Russia, whatever it was. And then there was, at one point, my name appears on a long list assembled by a PR person of people you might invite to some sort of social event with, 200 other people. I never got such an invitation. I'm not worried about it. But it was a bit startling to see that.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you think that there are people who are more implicated, who might have, stupidly gone to a dinner and then never seen him again, who are somehow implicated, injured by this process. What do you think about that?
Yes, I definitely think that there are probably some people in that category that made a bad decision to go to an event where he was, a prominent guest, or one of his dinners, at his own mansion, and they went because somebody invited them and told them, for example, the prince was going to be there. And so I do think, but I also think that those people that are in that category aren't mentioned repeatedly in these files.
Yeah,
so
hundreds
you have
of
to,
times, yeah.
Yeah, hundreds of times. It's different if you just see one person you knew had dinner with him one time and you don't see anything else in there.
Well, let me ask you this. What did the Biden administration do about all this? Why did the Biden administration sit on these documents? They had access to these files too, didn't they?
They definitely, and one would hope that they would have, really pressed and continued this investigation. We don't know that they didn't. We don't know that they weren't still investigating some of this. It's just not clear from the files whether they did or they didn't. And the other thing to remember is they did convict Maxwell, and she did appeal that conviction. So technically the case was still an open case. So you usually don't open your files when you still are investigating or litigating a conviction. So in some sense, that's one excuse I guess they could use. But I do think that, the Justice Department failed these survivors through almost every presidential administration that we've had. I mean, this should have been investigated throughout this time. And now what's really horrible about it is, as you know, when a crime is committed, especially against young people, children, as they get older, their memories fade. The evidence isn't as readily available. The diary that maybe these girls kept when they were 16 about this, probably they don't have anymore. So had the prosecutors done their job back in 2007, there would have not only been far less victims here, but he could have gone to prison, and we wouldn't even have this happening right now. We wouldn't even be talking about him.
What were Epstein's politics, and do they matter?
Let me tell you why I don't think it matters. Sexual assault doesn't discriminate based on political party. There were bad people on all sides here. There was not one party or the other, and it kind of frustrates me sometimes when people try to make this into a Republican versus Democrat issue, because it had nothing to do with that. It had to do with power and money and sex. And it really didn't matter what your political party was. There were people, as I said, on both sides here who were implicated or have been implicated.
But what were his politics? I just incidentally.
I'm sorry. He was more of a Democrat. He donated to both Republicans and Democrats, but he clearly was more aligned with the Democrats.
When you look at the array of people who spent time with Epstein, who among the high and the mighty do you come out shocked at how they behaved? Look at Bill Gates' behavior, for example. I don't know the guy. I've interviewed him on this program. But he's been in our lives in one way or another for a very long time, and I was appalled, although I should say that Gates denies the behavior that's mentioned in the files.
Yeah.
Who's in that list for you?
He's definitely one of the people I think everybody was a little surprised at, but
I wasn't a little surprised. I was a lot more than that. Yeah.
Well, you know what? I've been doing this for so long, and I just know from covering especially sexual assault cases, a lot of men act completely different. You wouldn't even know them when they're among their buddies, just talking about women. So in some ways, there really hasn't been a whole lot that has been surprising to me. Like I said, Gates is sort of this guy that seems like a little bit of a geek, quite frankly. So you wouldn't. But you know what? A lot of these men were older men too. So it's almost like maybe a club of people that don't normally get the girl, so to speak, and maybe
despite
that's
all
why.
Their wealth and power, they needed Epstein in some way to do what for them? To hook them up with children.
Yes, or young women. But it was done. It's important to understand this wasn't Epstein going to these women and girls and saying, I'm going to pay you $200 if you go have sex. If you have sex with me, or if you have sex with, so and so.
Yeah,
that's not what he did. He used fraudulent means, which is one of the elements of sex trafficking. In other words, he said, "I want to hire you as my assistant, and I'm going to pay you $100,000 a year," or I want to send you to college, or you're a great artist, or a ballerina, or a model. I know I can get you in the Victoria's Secret catalog. That's how he got these women trapped. And that's how he did it. He did not. And then they got kind of enamored with him, because he acted sort of like this father figure, and I'm going to change your life, and you can do this, that. There's tons of emails between him and women in these tranches that show him talking to these women that he wants to sort of snare. And then there's other emails that are clearly after he already had his way with them, or they got too old for him, where he's saying, well, I don't know what you want me to do about it. This was your choice. There are this trajectory that you could see with some of these women, that at first he kind of gets them under his wing and then makes them believe that he's going to change their lives, or that, some of them fell in love with him. And then you could see in later emails where he's essentially just discarding them.
Let's talk about conspiracies. QAnon, for a long time, has been full of crazy, lurid imagery about, God knows, human sacrifice And watching the grotesqueness of Epstein's world laid out in these documents, one after the other, how do you, again, this is not crediting QAnon with truth-telling, but I have to think that it fuels conspiracy thinking because, in fact, the Epstein world was full of it.
Yeah, and and I'll point out another part of this that isn't talked about much, but some of the victims here were really damaged. I mean, he didn't go after, he wouldn't have been able to go after someone who, had a lot of confidence and had a real life. He that had a future. He purposefully targeted vulnerable girls who came from nothing, or they were even homeless or in foster care, for example. And the damage that he did to some of these girls, affected them the rest of their lives. And there are some of it is victims, like you mentioned, those tips that we saw, that come from people who have been really traumatized. And that's why I'm saying I don't think you can discount all those crazy tips, because I have found that some of the women that had those crazy aspects to their stories, there was still some shred of truth to what they were saying. It's just that they were so traumatized. And this is common, by the way. I've talked to FBI specialists who interview especially children who have been traumatized. Your brain is almost damaged when something like this happens to you as a child.
One of the theories that was going around a lot, as you know, Julie, was the idea that somehow that Epstein was not only trying to enrich himself all the time and also have lots of girls, underage and otherwise, around him for the obvious purpose, but that he was working for some sort of foreign intelligence agency. That's. I assume you're discounting that.
This is how I look at that. I don't think it's impossible, but I haven't seen any evidence that shows that he worked as in employed by the CIA or Mossad or any other government. But I do think that he, like everything else that he did, he used his contacts in all these places, in Israel, in Russia, and in London, wherever he had a connection. He used that as currency in order to enrich himself, to make money in some way.
Is there any evidence that you credit that he did not commit suicide in jail?
Well, I don't think he committed suicide.
You don't?
No, I absolutely do not think he committed suicide.
You're making a supposition. You don't have evidence that this was the case.
Well, what's evidence? Evidence that, that the guards lied on their reports and never reported that they reported they made checks on him and he didn't? Is it that all the cameras didn't work? Is it that, by the way, they didn't take pictures of the scene? They never treated it like a crime scene. They never recovered the so-called noose that, the piece of fabric that he allegedly used. They don't even know which one it was. The fact that if he broke 3 bones in his neck, which is with a lot of force, this man was a very frail man at the end. Even if he was to do that by tying himself to his bunk, the top bunk, every single item on that top bunk was undisturbed. If you're pulling on a bunk with enough force to break 3 bones in your neck, wouldn't you think that the items would have been sort of toppled? I could just go on and on. The reports are very odd. He allegedly tried to commit suicide before this, a couple weeks before this. But when he went in to tell them what had happened, when they found him on the floor, the first thing he said is, my roommate did it to me. He tried to kill me, and that he had been threatening me for weeks. His roommate, his cellmate, why would you even put a former ex-cop who was in jail for killing 4 people, that was the cellmate that you picked for Jeffrey Epstein? too many things don't make any sense. Epstein said he tried to kill him, and then he sort of changed his story and said, I don't remember. But Epstein never said he tried to commit suicide. He only said that he thought that his cellmate had tried to kill him.
Julie, if you had had the opportunity to interview him in prison, what would you ask him? What would you want to know?
I think that I would have asked him about, in my view, I think he believed he was above the law. And I think I would have tried to get at that and why he thought he was above the law. Who are these people that you associated with? Did anybody lead you to believe this? Who knows? He would have said, everybody has a price, or, I was smart because I got the right people in my corner. And I think I would have tried to sort of get him to admit that there were other people that were in this to help him get away with these crimes, that it wasn't just, an act of nature that, they decided not to go after him.
Julie, you've been on this story for years. You've spent a lot of time with people who've been harmed terribly by Epstein. You've been immersed in this, and it's very hard to explain to civilians what being immersed in a story for year after year can be like, especially something this ugly. What mark has it left on your life?
You have to be a little driven to do this kind of work and to keep hammering at it. I've hammered at it. It wasn't just the first story. I've hammered at it all this time. And I think, really, to be honest with you, it's the victims. And with almost anything that I've done. When I covered prisons, I remember some of those inmates who were tortured. And so with this story, I think about the victims all the time. And I think, I just think as if they were, a friend of mine or a daughter, if it was my daughter, I just feel like, they can't all be lying, this happened. And I just feel driven by the fact that people have covered it up. They've covered it up. And I think that I'm going to keep working on it until we find out why they're covering it up or who is covering it up.
Julie Brown, thank you.
Thank you.